Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Today, I'm excited to tell you about a new series we are starting on the podcast called When Life Doesn't Make Sense. That phrase, when life doesn't make sense, is one that I think all of us can resonate with to a certain degree. Whether your story holds miscarriage, financial struggles, unfulfilled longings, a wayward child, an ailing body, grief that feels cruel, mental illness, or the scars of abuse, I know that you come to this episode with your own story of pain. Maybe you can relate to that feeling of before and after, when life is disobedient and you're left with an experience or set of circumstances that has carved a line through your story and through your soul. But what do we do? And how do we find joy, hope, and love when life becomes undone? These are questions I've sat with over the last few months, and my hope is that this series offers a way for us to create language and community around some of life's most painful moments. Every single one of my writing projects and podcast episodes comes from an idea that slowly evolves over time as I lean into listening, learning, and asking lots of questions. And this series is no exception. So in today's episode, I'm going to set some groundwork by sharing some of what I've been learning and pondering over the last few months, and I'll also give you an overview of what you can expect coming up on the podcast. But to start off, I wanted to ask if I could share a little bit about how this series connects to my own life and story, and why this topic is so important to me. I was really young when I first had a sense inside of me that I didn't know how to talk to God about my pain. Of course, I didn't have actual words for this yet. It more so showed up in the way I attempted to manage my internal world, to make sure that I wasn't too anxious, sad, or doubtful for God to want to be close to me. You see, when I was a little girl, I used to have 2 journals. Every morning, I remember opening my prayer journal to neatly pen my gratitude to God for His goodness and grace. Then I'd open my personal journal, where my real thoughts, emotions, and questions would messily spill out. I kept this journal under lock and key, promising myself that these were words He'd never see. One journal held my praise, and the other held my pain. I didn't know how to talk to God about both. This kind of honesty with God required a gut-level confidence that He loved and accepted me even when I was sad, confused, and angry. And pain has a way of creating difficult emotions inside of us that I wasn't sure God liked. That 6-year-old me eventually evolved into a 16-year-old me that was completely disconnected from my own heart and emotions. Growing up as a pastor's kid and then a missionary kid, I had deeply internalized a narrative that we demonstrate holiness by demonstrating happiness. Perhaps you resonate with this narrative too. When I was 18, I took a gap year to attend a Bible college in Europe. This biblical studies certification program was fairly intensive, and we'd spend hours every day immersed in the Old and New Testament. I learned so much about God. Every week, I submitted very polished papers with strong intellectual arguments that were flawlessly aligned with the rubric and were edited to perfection. But I lived with a deep-seated uncertainty if God would want to bear the weight of my unedited soul. In order to suppress all these uncomfortable emotions, I disengaged from my heart and took shelter in my head. That April, I completed my biblical studies program as third in my class and was all set to start my undergrad in ministry that fall. And I had never been more suicidal. Being fine had become the means by which I lived out my faith, and it left me emotionally fragmented and disconnected from an internal sea of griefs, thoughts, and questions towards God that remained suppressed and unprocessed inside of me. Thoughts and questions like, God, I know you're not mean, but it feels like you are today. And am I truly safe if I trust you? And if you love me, why is this happening? Although I began a long journey of therapy at 18, this pattern in my life continued, offering God the best of me, but shrinking back from offering him all of me. Throughout college and grad school, I latched on to tasks for God because I didn't know how to be with God. I didn't know how to bring all of myself to him, especially the parts of me that I didn't like. Avoiding my emotions worked as long as I didn't slow down. My schedule stayed constantly too full between student leadership and serving at my church and Bible classes. In a way, these were my attempts at staying close to God, but not too close. I was doing good, God-honoring things, but my identity was rooted in responsibilities rather than relationship. Reflecting on my life up to this point, I've begun to recognize that I had no language other than what the church was giving me to process and engage my pain. And this narrative sounded a lot like trust in God and faith over fear and Jesus is the answer to everything. But the story I was carrying in my body, one of disordered eating, crippling anxiety, and shame, told a very different one than this triumphant story I'd learned to expect and esteem. In a Christian narrative that resounded of resurrection victory, I didn't know what to do with the parts of my story and with the parts of me that held trauma and wounding. What do you do when it feels like your body is betraying your morality? I remember thinking, is something wrong with me? I didn't know how to let my pain matter or to be present with God as he was present with me in it. In so many Christian contexts today, we've absorbed an understanding of faith that requires life to work out. But what happens when it doesn't? What do we do when we feel a sense of divine remoteness or abandonment in our most painful and devastating moments? I recently finished the book Dark Clouds and Deep Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament. And as the author writes about walking through suffering, he made an observation that has stayed with me. He says that when God feels silent in these places, we can gradually become silent. And this silence is a soul killer. Some of us become angry, and this anger eventually becomes a self-made prison of despair and bitterness. Or some of us can hide in a cave of denial, pretending like everything is fine. But in both of these responses, I see a common theme. This sense that we must choose between emotions and closeness. We can choose pain, or we can choose belief, but we can't have both. However, when I look to the Gospels, I don't see this tension reflected in the life of Jesus. During most of my time in undergrad, I was captivated with the Gospel accounts. The more I read, the more I glimpsed at the humanity of Jesus. These Gospel stories recounted a God who got angry and wept, who ate good food, grew tired, slept hard, laughed, and felt intense physical and emotional pain. And he was fully alive and awake to all of this. I saw the embodiment of an emotional God who felt deeply, leaned into community, stayed actively engaged in his inner life, and chose to honor his own limitations and physicality. Isaiah 53:3 describes Jesus as deeply understanding every excruciating part of the human experience. One translation depicts him as a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Another translation describes him as a man who is deeply acquainted with grief. Jesus knew the agony of betrayal and the sting of denial. He knew the ache of grief, rejection, and loneliness. He understands what it feels like for a cup of suffering not to be removed, no matter how much you plead or urgently pray. I think about that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is described as experiencing such intense anguish that he sweated drops of blood. And then later on the cross, when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Acknowledging his fears and paying attention to his own heart in the presence of the love and compassion of the Father was what kept him rooted, sustaining and nourishing intimacy. As I became more and more acquainted with the laughter and tears of Jesus, I sensed God's invitation to become more connected with my own, with my griefs, sorrow, and pain. Slowly, I'm learning that emotions and relationship were never supposed to be on opposite ends of the spectrum. Hard emotions actually indicate that I am bringing my full self to God. He wants to bear witness to every part of us, and in doing so, he invites us to bear witness to more and more of him. This is where durable faith is formed. So in the coming weeks, you'll be hearing conversations that I've hosted with 8 different people. In these conversations, they share their stories of pain and sorrow and what they're learning about hope, lament, joy, and courage when life gets really hard. These conversations are beautiful. A verse I've been reflecting on recently is Ecclesiastes 7:4, which says, "The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning." What I love about this verse is the connection that the author makes between a heart of wisdom and the ability to enter into our own grief. What each of these guests do is graciously invite us into their own inner house of mourning, to the thoughts they are thinking, questions they are asking, and emotions they are feeling around some of life's most painful moments. And let me just say, I deeply connected with every one of their stories. While my story doesn't share the same details as theirs, I deeply connected with the emotions, thoughts, and questions threaded throughout each conversation. I think of Jess and Lauren's stories, where they both process recent miscarriages and the following question that surfaced: what do you do when grief feels cruel? Or Jennifer's story, where she recounts years of sexual and spiritual abuse at the hands of a religious leader. What do you do when your trauma happens in a Christian context? Or Carly's story, where she names the loneliness that comes with singleness. What do you do when decades pass and the life you dreamed of never comes? Each of these guests share their experience of feeling cracked open and graciously guide us into a deeper place of personal processing. They share how they are encountering Jesus as the man of sorrows, the one who is well acquainted with grief. I always ground each podcast series in a passage of scripture, and when the idea for this series first came to me, I had one story from the Gospels in mind. But about halfway through the interviews, I switched passages. It was clear to me what I saw reflected in these guests was Genesis 32, when Jacob wrestles with God. If you're not familiar with this passage, it describes an encounter that Jacob has with God in the Old Testament. This encounter involves a wrestling match, which God initiates. Listen to how the passage describes it, starting in verse 24. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. He replied, "Jacob." "Your name will no longer be Jacob," the man told him. "From now on, you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with man and have won." "Please tell me your name," Jacob said. "Why do you want to know my name?" the man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." In this passage, Jacob was in pain, but he was not silent. He didn't stop talking to God. He didn't pull away, but leaned in with honesty, tenacity, and persistence. He wrestled with God and didn't hold back. This passage speaks to a shifting in his identity. It was the birthplace of a deeper kind of intimacy. There was a soul-level renaming that took place in this deeper kind of engagement with God. My hope is that this is what we can process together over the upcoming weeks. The wounding, the blessing, and the struggle of this divine kind of wrestling in some of life's most painful places. As always, I'll be sending out an email on Wednesdays that connects to the topic of that week's podcast episode. These emails are filled with reflection questions, resources, and links to help you process the episode more deeply. If you aren't yet part of this Substack community, I hope you'll join in, especially for this next series. You can subscribe through the link in the show notes. And one last thing, if you haven't followed the podcast, I'd love to invite you to do so. Also, it would mean so much to me if you took 5 minutes to rate and review the podcast. Reviews really help to get these episodes out to a wider audience, and I'd be so grateful for your partnership in this way. Until next week. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.